George Bailey. You remember George Bailey, don't you? George was the director of the local savings and loan company in Bedford Falls. George's dream since childhood had been to travel around the globe, but his dreams never materialized. Why? Circumstances, family, responsibility, guilt. Choose one. Choose them all. Regardless, George's dreams never happened. George continues through life, and things aren't going well. And at one point, he is so down, he is so desperate, that George decides that the world, Bedford Falls in particular, would have been better off had he not been born. Well, Clarence, his guardian angel, is sent down from heaven. And Clarence, he's got a bit of an ulterior motive, not only to help George through this tough situation, but also, if he's successful in this, Clarence will get his winnings. This movie, It's a Wonderful Life, has been a Christmas classic for decades, and for many families, it's a must-see event every year. On the other hand, there are any number of people who would dispute this title, It's a Wonderful Life. They would probably say, it's a terrible life, and they would offer their own life as the first piece of evidence to support that claim. There was a man who worked for the post office in Australia. His job was to process all the mail that came through that had illegible addresses. One day a letter came addressed in real shaky handwriting, a letter addressed to God, and it had no further address. He thought, maybe I should open this and see what it is. The letter read, Dear God, I am an 83-year-old widow living on a very small pension. Yesterday, someone stole my purse. It had $100 in it, which is all the money I had until my next pension payment. Next Sunday is Christmas, and I had invited 2 of my friends over for dinner. Without that money, I have nothing to buy food with. I have no family to turn to, and you are my only hope. Can you help me, please? It's signed, Sincerely, Edna. Sounds like a terrible life, doesn't it? The postal worker was touched. He took the letter and he showed it to all of his co-workers. And each one dug into their pocket and gave a few dollars here, a few dollars there. And they came up with a total of $96. So they put it in an envelope and they addressed it to Edna, sent it off to her. And they're feeling pretty good about what they've done. The rest of the day, they've got this just warm glow over what they've done for Edna. Christmas came and went. A few days later, another letter came from this same little old lady. All the workers gathered around. He gathered them all around. They opened the letter, and it read, Dear God, how can I ever thank you enough for what you did for me? Because of your gift of love, I was able to fix a glorious dinner for my friends. We had a very nice day, and I told my friends of your wonderful gift. By the way, there was $4 missing. I think it might have been those jerks at the post office. Sincerely, Edna. Maybe you've had times when you felt like your world was like George Bailey's world or like Edna's world. It oscillates between it's a wonderful life and it's a terrible life. Some people seem to get stuck in the it's a terrible life mode. They never get back to it's a wonderful life. Well, what do you do? If you're in that situation right now, whether it's more of a permanent, more of a temporary, it doesn't matter. But if you're thinking it's a terrible life, how do we deal with that? How do we face that kind of situation? Just know you're far from being alone if you feel like you're in a terrible life. Sir Ernest Shackleton was a British explorer, made 3 trips to the Antarctic to do explorations there. He was asked to tell of his most terrible moment in his explorations. He said his most horrible, most terrifying, most terrible moment was in an emergency hut. They had a night when their ship had been crushed by ice, and they had to actually camp on floating ice until they could get to an island area. They're in this emergency hut. He said he and his men were lying there, and Shackleton is a little bit separated from the others. They'd given out the last ration of biscuits to all the men. I suspect that Shackleton and his crew at this moment would say, it's a terrible life. In the midst of the night, Shackleton sensed a stealthy movement. And he noticed one of the men who's kind of checking out everyone in the area. And this man is determined that everyone else is asleep. So he reaches over the man beside him and gets his bag that has his biscuits in it. And Shackleton is just stunned. He said, this is a man I would have trusted my life with. And here in this horrible situation we're facing, is he going to steal this man's last biscuit? He watches. And this man takes the biscuit out of the bag. But then he senses another movement. The man opens his own box, takes out his basket, or his bag of biscuits, takes his biscuit out, puts it in the other man's bag, puts the other biscuit back in, and then reaches over and puts it back. It's a terrible life. But this man was willing to give life-sustaining element to someone else. We may face some times when we feel like it's a terrible life. This morning we're going to look at Psalm 55, a psalm of David. In these few verses we're going to look at this morning, David's emotions are probably like the emotions of the postal workers. They're up, they're down, they're back up, they're back down. And maybe you can relate to that. We'll look first at Psalm 55, verses 1 and 2. God, listen to my prayer, and do not ignore my plea for help. Pay attention to me and answer me. I am restless and in turmoil with my complaint. Sounds like David's a little bit upset. The Message Bible has a version that maybe would be more to what you and I would say when we are having a terrible life. The Message Bible reads, "Open your ears, God, to my prayers. Don't pretend you don't hear me knocking. Come close and whisper your answer. I really need you." Isn't that how we often feel when we're in the midst of a terrible life? Don't pretend you don't hear me knocking, God. Come close. Whisper your answer. I really need you. That's what David is feeling right now. And David is feeling frustration. You can hear the frustration as we read through these two verses. King David certainly was a man of emotion. We hear his unabashed outpouring of every feeling within his body as we read through the Psalms that are attributed to him. It's not just this one. All of his Psalms, David puts it out there. He doesn't hold back. And these first two verses of Psalm 55 demonstrate emotion many of us have probably personally experienced, although typically not for the same reason that David is as he writes this psalm. We get frustrated in life, don't we? We can all relate to being frustrated. We get frustrated when our order at the drive-thru window is wrong. We get frustrated when the traffic snarls delay our drive to or from home. We get frustrated when the government messes with our life. We get frustrated when the pastor preaches about money. We get frustrated, don't we? In his book, Stress Fractures, Chuck Swindoll relates a personal story. He said, "I vividly remember sometimes being caught in an undertow of too many commitments in too few days. It wasn't long before I was snapping at my wife and our children, choking down my food at meal times, and feeling irritated at those unexpected interruptions throughout the day. Before long, things around our house started reflecting the pattern of my hurry-up style." He said it was becoming unbearable. I distinctly recall after supper one evening the words of our youngest daughter, Colleen. She wanted to tell me something important that had happened to her at school that day. She hurriedly began, "Daddy, I want to tell you something, and I'll tell you really fast." Suddenly, realizing her frustration, I answered, "Honey, you can tell me, and you don't have to tell me really fast. Say it slowly." He said, I'll never forget her answer. "Then listen slowly." Frustration is a part of being on this planet. David is asking God to listen to him. He's frustrated because he's been praying and so far he's not gotten an answer. So he is frustrated. But we also hear David's anguish in the tonality of his words. There's a deep, deep emotional distress that's driving his words, his very forceful prayer. And what's driving this? Let's look at verses 3 through 5. Because of the enemy's voice, because of the pressure of the wicked, for they bring down disaster on me and harass me in anger. My heart shudders within me. Terrors of death sweep over me. Fear and trembling grip me. Horror has overwhelmed me. Sounds like he's having a really bad day, doesn't it? That he might be justified in saying it's a terrible life. And we've dealt with some of those things when we think about the enemy. The enemy who can attack us in so many ways, so many forms. We've dealt with those. But when the pressure's on, how do we handle that? Well, God has given us this great automatic system that kicks in when the pressure's on. Two physiological responses. One of those two are going to kick in, either fight or flight. When the thermostat goes up in our life, we instinctively go into this fight or flight mode. It just happens for us. And David, like us, will have different response in different situations. If we look at 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verses 26 and 31 through 32, here's a situation that you're very familiar with. There's this guy who's on the other side over there. David's brothers, they're out there, they're part of the army. David's a sheep herder at this point. And he's sent to kind of check on the brothers. Dad says, hey, go see what they're up to. So he goes, and when he gets there, he finds out there's this guy on the other side who's kind of bad-mouthing God. Bad-mouthing the Hebrew army. This guy's called Goliath. Now, we got the sheep herder who's hearing all this. We got the army. We have the king, Saul, and all of his men, all of his army, they're saying, I'm not fighting that guy. Have you seen how big this guy is? Have you felt that way about some of the enemies that you've faced in your life? When you're having that really terrible day? It's a big, big enemy. And the flight mode seems a whole lot easier than the fight mode does. But David doesn't go for that. David says, I'll fight him. He's the kid. He's been out in the fields. He's not a trained warrior. But when he hears what Goliath is doing, what Goliath is saying about his God, he goes into the fight mode. So there he is as a teenager. He's ready to fight. Here he is as the king of Israel. And what's he doing? Something very different. We see fear. We hear the fear in his voice as he talks about the enemy. Admittedly, at any point in time, any of us can be subject to fear, depending upon the situation, depending upon the event that's going on. In the book Point Man, Steve Farrar tells this story. He said the photographer for a national magazine was assigned to shoot this great forest fire that was burning. He was told that a small plane would be waiting for him at the airport. So he got to the airstrip about an hour before sundown. He jumps in the plane with all of his gear and said, let's go. The Cessna is sitting there, so the guy cranks it up quickly. They take off. The pilot swung the plane out over the horizon there, and they're in the air pretty soon. The photographer says, fly north over the north side of the fire there and make several low-level passes. Well, why? Asked this very nervous pilot. Because I'm going to take pictures, said the photographer. I'm a photographer, and that's what photographers do. We take pictures. And after a long pause, the pilot replies, so you're not the instructor pilot? Do you ever have cause for being in a situation and you got fear? We fear the small paycheck. We fear the big bills after Christmas. We fear the kids' report cards and the doctor's report. When we are in fear, we are not experiencing a wonderful life. David in this moment is saying, God, it's a terrible life. He was dealing with this overwhelming fear, and unlike when he was a young man, he went into the flight mode. Verses 6 and 7, David said, If only I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and find rest. How far away I would flee. I would stay in the wilderness. This is the guy who took on Goliath, puts him on the ground, cuts off his head. I mean, he's the hero. He's now the king. He's saying, if I had the wings of a dove, I would fly. I would get away from this situation. It's a terrible life, and I want out of it. We can feel that way. Sometimes we feel embarrassed that we felt the desire to flee, but God has given us that as a sense of protection. Sometimes fleeing is the best thing. Fear. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions that we face and that we deal with. One gentleman told about his little girl. He said, our little 3-year-old daughter, Abby, was having trouble sleeping throughout the night because she was afraid. He said, each time as I retucked her into bed, I'd remind her that Jesus was with her and that He would keep her safe. The sleepless nights, so they continued. Abby would come to our bedroom seeking comfort. He said, finally one night I asked her if she had prayed for Jesus to take her fear away and help her fall asleep. She said, oh yes, He told me to come and get you. Sometimes we feel like we need someone else to help us through. Like you, or like me, or like Abby, David's looking for someone to help him. He's felt frustration. Certainly he's felt the desire for isolation, to move away, but now David also thinks about retaliation. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I believe that probably every one of us in here, at some point in time, when someone has hurt you, someone has offended you, someone has wronged you, you've had the thought about retaliation. Whether you did it or if God just sent a lightning bolt down and hit them right on the spot, you would like to see that retaliation, wouldn't you? I mean, it's our nature. We want that. In Psalm 55, verse 15, David's going to call for God to severely punish his adversary. He said, let death take them by surprise. Let them go down to Sheol alive, because evil is in their homes and within them. Now think about this verse. Let death take them by surprise. Let them go down to Sheol alive. What he's saying, let them go to hell alive. Let them just suddenly have this realization that they're in hell. That's retaliation in its classic form, isn't it? It's amazing what David, a man after God's own heart, remember that. A man after God's own heart is calling for these people to be sent straight to hell. Now, the Message Bible phrases it rather uniquely. Haul my betrayers off alive to hell. Let them experience the horror. Let them feel every desolate detail of a damned life. That's pretty severe retaliation, isn't it? You could probably plug in someone's name at some point in time and ask for that same retaliation, couldn't you? But that's just us. That's just people. Why is this? This desire for David's enemies to be punished, it's really not out of character for David. We read in Psalm 109, verses 7 through 12. When he is judged, let him be found guilty, and let his prayer be counted as sin. Let his days be few. He's saying, cut his life short, God. Let another take over his position. Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Take him out, God. Let his children wander as he beggars, searching for food far from their demolished homes. Okay, wipe out their house too. Let a creditor seize all he has. Let strangers plunder what he has worked for. Let no one show him kindness, and let no one be gracious to his fatherless children. David is ticked. So it's not just a one-time instance as we read through Psalm 55, but we see this in other times as David writes and David calls upon God. He wants some retaliation. We feel like David. Sometimes we feel frustration. Sometimes we feel the isolation. We want to get away from it, but also we feel retaliation would be in order from God. David's definitely a man who wants payback. Retribution is on his mind in both of these Psalms. And you felt that way, I'm sure, when someone has hurt you, cheated you, or wronged you. Revenge is inflicting harm or punishment or another way to pay back for injury or insult. Revenge was a way of life among the Hebrew people of the Old Testament. So David never, ever hesitated to ask Yahweh to even the score with his enemies. Happy to go to God and saying, take them out. Make their children fatherless. Make his wife a widow. Destroy the home. Do it, God. We feel the same way, don't we? Bill Miller decided that a train was taking altogether too long to cross the street. He's waiting 15 minutes for this train to cross. And Bill is tired of it. So, after the train passed, he drove his pickup truck onto the track, locked the doors, and walked the rest of the way to work. Cars could get by, but the train could not. A crewman from a halted freight train telephoned police and complained about this truck that's parked on the track. Police traced Miller because of his license plate, convinced him to move his truck after the train had been stopped for 20 minutes. And the police declined to give Bill a ticket. Do you ever feel like doing something in retaliation for what life is doing to you? David did. Old Testament style versus New Testament. Old Testament versus New Testament. Keep this in mind. Now, we might like the Old Testament style, retaliation. Go get them, God. Sick them. We might like that. But the New Testament approach could be a little frustrating because we don't get to do that. In Luke 6, verse 27, Jesus said, "But I say to you who listen, love your enemies. Do what is good to those who hate you." Really? Do I have to, God? Won't you just go ahead and wipe them out? I like David's style, God. And Jesus says, love your enemies. We would like to pour the burning coals on their head, wouldn't we? We would like to do that. Do what is good to those who hate you. That's the emotional roller coaster that you and I deal with, that David dealt with. David's not experiencing a wonderful life. He, at this moment, is dealing with a terrible life. His frustration is leading him to virtually demand that God respond to his prayers. David's desire for isolation, his desire to flee, is normal. David's penchant for retaliation surfaces just a few lines later as he asks God to send his tormentor to hell while still alive. This is the classic, "You've hurt me, so you need to be roasted like a marshmallow" type of response. So what is fueling all this? What's really driving David's words? It's David's humiliation. The biggest factor is not what has been done to David, but who has done it. It's not the what, it's the who that's put David into this "it's a terrible life" mode. In Psalm 55, verses 12 through 14, "Now it is not an enemy who insults me." Now he's talking about someone, he says, send them to hell, but you notice how he describes them? It is not an enemy who insults me. Otherwise I could bear it. See, I expect it from my enemies. Otherwise I could bear it. It is not a foe who rises up against me, someone I've seen in battle before. It's not a foe like that. Otherwise I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer, my companion and good friend. We used to have close fellowship. We walked with the crowd into the house of God. It's someone that he knows. Some theologians believe that this is speaking about David's son Absalom. But I believe it's another person who's the object of David's fury and David's pain. One of the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba was a division within his own family. This division resulted in the actual rebellion of David's son Absalom. Absalom goes to the point, he becomes really, if you will, a politician. He sits at the city gate. He is at the city gate and he works the crowds as they're coming in. And Scripture describes it that he steals their hearts. He steals the hearts of the men of Israel. He turns them from David to him. And one of his advisors during this time is a man named Ahithophel. Ahithophel had served as a governmental advisor, very well respected, actually consulted by David himself in years past. How important was this man Ahithophel? 2 Samuel 16, verse 23. Now the advice Ahithophel gave in those days was like someone asking about a word from God. Think about that. They valued him, they treasured his information so much that it was like someone asking about a word from God. Such was the regard both David and Absalom had for Ahithophel's advice. Both Absalom and David. This is a man David had befriended. This is a man David had counted on. This is a man David had sought counsel from. This is who I believe this scripture is talking about. Because when we read through this, verse 13, it is you, a man who is my peer. David would never speak about Absalom, his son, as being his peer. But Ahithophel, a man I've sought counsel with, a man I have befriended, yeah, that's someone. See, now David feels humiliated because this man he's consulted, this man he has befriended, this man he's walked into the house of God with, is consulting with Absalom, his son, and helping him orchestrate the overthrow, the coup of the kingdom of Israel. I think George Bailey could sympathize with David's frustration. I think George Bailey could understand David's isolation, his desire to get away. Remember, George Bailey said, I just wish I'd never been born. See, that's his thinking. I want to get away from the situation I'm dealing with right now. I think George Bailey could embrace David's sense of retaliation. George probably would like to have taken care of the banker. We and George Bailey and David can feel those kind of things. George felt humiliated when the savings and loans suddenly had the money that was missing, and he was going to be ruined. David felt humiliated when he found that the man of God that he had sought, the man he had counseled, was now counseling his son and guiding him on an overthrow. So what do we do? In the midst of the pressure, because life does bring pressure, what do we do in the midst of pressure? What do we do when we are in the midst of a terrible life? How do we get to the point of believing and knowing that we have a wonderful life? Psalm 55, verses 16 through 18. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. You see, we're talking salvation there. I call to God, and the Lord will save me. I complain and groan morning, noon, and night. Ever done that? And He hears my voice. Though many are against me, He will redeem me from my battle unharmed. Oh, I may have some scars, but I will be unharmed. And 55, verse 22. Cast your burdens on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. When you feel like it's a terrible life, just know that you can call on the Lord, and He will save you. You can complain morning, noon, and night, and He will hear your voice. He will take you from the battle unharmed. We sang just a bit ago, farther along, we'll know more about it. And we will. But the reality is, God's Word tells us some things that we need to know right now to get through the times when we feel like it's a terrible life. Trust in Jesus. Trust in the Lord for all those difficult situations that you feel like I can't get through on my own. Let's stand.